I'm sitting on a cracked, sun-bleached plastic chair in a humid precinct in Old San Juan. The air is thick, tasting of salt, exhaust, and the kind of cheap floor cleaner that only pretends to mask the scent of decades of human desperation. I haven't showered in 3 days. My white linen shirt, custom-tailored in London and once the height of Newport sophistication, is now a roadmap of grease stains and yellowed sweat. I can feel the grit of the Caribbean sand in the creases of my neck, and every time I move, the dried salt on my skin itches like 1,000 tiny needles. Across from me, a young officer is tapping away at a computer that looks like it belongs in a museum. The monitor flickers, casting a sickly green light over his tired face. Behind him, a ceiling fan wobbles dangerously on its mount, making a rhythmic thwack 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 sound that mimics the frantic beating of my own heart. I try to focus on a single gecko crawling across the yellowing wall, just to keep from screaming. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a descent into a hell my own blood had hand-delivered me to. My name is Harrison Sterling Thorne. For 45 years, the name Thorne was synonymous with the finest private shipyards on the East Coast. We didn't just build boats, we built floating cathedrals for the world's elite. I've shaken hands with presidents, dined with monarchs, and employed over 300 men who called me sir, not out of fear, but out of a respect I thought I had earned. I spent my life ensuring my family would never know the sting of a cold room or an empty stomach. I thought I was building a legacy. What I was actually building was a gilded cage, and the locks were about to turn from the outside. The officer looks up, his expression shifting from boredom to a flicker of something that looks dangerously like pity. "Mr. Thorne," he says, his accent thick and slow. "I've run the name again. There is no record of a Harrison Thorne on the manifest of the Azure Empress." I feel the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. "That's impossible," I rasp. My voice sounds like it's been dragged over gravel. "I was in Suite 702. My son, Sterling Thorne II, made the reservation. My daughter Victoria was with me at the market. Check again, please." He sighs, a heavy sound that tells me he's heard every lie a vagrant can spin. "I have checked, sir. There is a Sterling Thorne II. There is a Sloane Thorne and a Garrett Thorne. There is even a young boy, Leo, but no Harrison. According to the cruise line's digital record, that suite was booked for 4 adults and 1 child. You aren't on the list." The room begins to spin. My own children, the people I'd given everything to, hadn't just left me behind. They had systematically erased my existence before we even left the dock in Rhode Island. 3 days ago, I was standing on the mahogany deck of the Azure Empress, the wind whipping through my thinning white hair. My grandson, Leo, a quiet 12-year-old with my late wife Eleanor's soft amber eyes, had crept up beside me. He looked terrified. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my blazer, his knuckles white. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice trembling so low I had to lean down to hear him. "Don't go into the city tomorrow. Just stay in the room. Tell them you're sick." I laughed then. I actually laughed and ruffled his hair, thinking he was just being an overprotective kid who'd watched too many spy movies. "Nonsense, Leo. Your Aunt Victoria wants to show me the old forts. It'll be a grand time. Besides, I need the fresh air." He didn't smile back. He looked at me with a profound, soul-deep sadness that a child his age should never possess. "They won't wait for you, Grandpa. They told me the ship won't wait." I brushed it off as a misunderstanding. I thought he was talking about the strict departure times. I was an old fool, blinded by the belief that a father's love is a two-way street. The flashback is interrupted by the station door groaning open. A woman walks in, shaking a wet umbrella. She's in her late 60s, wearing a sensible floral dress and a pair of oversized sunglasses that she perches atop a mane of elegant silver hair. She stops when she sees me. This is Beatriz Ortega. She was the only person who had looked me in the eye when I was frantic at the pier, screaming at the vanishing wake of the ship. "He is still here?" Beatriz asks the officer, her voice sharp and commanding. The officer shrugs. "No ID, no money, no record of him on the ship. What can I do, Beatriz?" "I can't arrest him for being forgotten." Beatriz walks over to me, and for the first time in 72 hours, I feel the touch of a human hand that doesn't want to push me away. She places a cool palm on my forearm. "I saw him, officer. I was on the same deck. I saw this man dining with that family, the tall, arrogant one with the gold watch and the woman who looked like she was smelling something rotten. They were with him." She looks at me, her eyes narrowing with a fierce intelligence. "Mr. Thorne, I saw your daughter, the one in the yellow sundress. I saw her lead you into that crowded textile market in the Plaza de Armas. I saw her tell you to wait by the blue door while she went to find a restroom. And then, I saw her run. She didn't go to a restroom. She took a side alley, hopped into a waiting black car, and they drove straight for the port. My heart feels like it's being squeezed by a giant's fist. She ran? Like the devil was at her heels, Beatrice says grimly. I tried to follow, but the crowd was too thick. By the time I got back to the pier, the Azure Empress was already pulling its gangway. I saw your son, the one with the cold eyes, standing on the balcony of the high-tier suites. He wasn't looking for you. He was holding a glass of champagne, watching the shoreline as if he were finally admiring a view that had been obstructed for years. The betrayal finally begins to sink in, cold and heavy like lead. It wasn't just a missed connection. It wasn't an accident. It was a choreographed execution of my life as I knew it. I remember the morning of the port call. My daughter Victoria, my princess, had been so attentive. She'd practically insisted I leave my travel vest in the cabin. "Oh, Daddy, it's far too humid for that heavy thing. Leave your passport and your wallet in the suite safe. I've got my card, I'll take care of everything. Let's just have a day where you don't have to be the boss for once." I had smiled, touched by her rare show of affection. I left my life in that safe. My phone, my credits cards, my medication, and the original copy of Eleanor's final trust, the one document that kept the Thorne maritime empire in my control until my death. I had handed them the keys to my kingdom and walked straight into the trap they'd set with a smile. The officer's computer chirps. He looks at the screen, then back at me, his brow furrowed. "That's strange." "What?" I ask, my voice cracking. "I just got a ping from the cruise line's security office. They're reporting a security incident regarding Suite 702. Apparently, the occupants reported a disturbed elderly man who had been stalking the family and attempted to gain access to their room before they departed. They filed a formal restraining order to be enacted the moment they dock back in the States. I stand up so fast the plastic chair screeches against the floor. Stalking? I'm the one who paid for the damn suite. I transferred $50,000 to Sterling's account to cover the family bonding expenses. "Do you have a receipt?" the officer asks, his voice returning to that flat, bureaucratic drone. "It's on my phone, in the safe, on the ship." I'm shouting now, my hands shaking. Beatrice grabs my shoulders, forcing me to sit back down. "Steady, Harrison. This is what they want. They want you to look like the disturbed old man. If you lose your head, you prove their point." She turns to the officer. "Look at him. Does he look like a stalker, or does he look like a man who's had his soul ripped out? I am a retired school principal and a grandmother. I will swear an affidavit. This man was a passenger. If your system says he wasn't, then someone hacked that system." The officer looks uncomfortable. "Ma'am, that's a serious accusation. These ships have military-grade encryption, and the Thorne family has the money to buy the people who write the code," I mutter, the realization hitting me. Sterling, too, was always the tech-savvy one. He'd spent years complaining that my analog ways were holding the company back. He wanted to pivot to automated freight. I wanted to keep the human touch of the shipyards. We had clashed for a decade, but I thought it was just business. I look down at my hands, the hands that built a multi-million-dollar empire, and they are trembling. I have nothing. I am a ghost in a foreign city, 3,000 miles from home, with my own children telling the world I'm a lunatic. Beatrice leans in close, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Harrison, listen to me. I have a small guest house in the hills. It is not a palace, but it is safe. We will get you food. We will get you rest. And then, we will find a way to fight." "Why?" I ask, looking at this stranger. "Why are you helping me?" She smiles, and for a second she looks remarkably like Eleanor. "Because I know what it's like to be discarded by people who think you've outlived your usefulness. And because I think a man like you doesn't just disappear. You're a thorn. You build things. Now, you're going to build a fire." As I stand to leave the precinct with her, I look back at the officer. He's already moved on to the next file, erasing me from his mind as easily as my son erased me from the manifest. I walk out into the humid San Juan night. The neon lights of the tourist bars reflect in the puddles, vibrant and mocking. Far out on the horizon, I can see the faint, twinkling lights of a ship. It could be the Azure Empress. It could be my children, celebrating their newfound freedom with my money, in my suites, wearing the jewelry I bought them. I feel a coldness settle in my gut that has nothing to do with the night air. They think I'm done. They think a 78-year-old man without a passport is a problem that will solve itself in the back alleys of a Caribbean port. What they don't know, what they've forgotten in their greed, is that the sea doesn't just take, it eventually spits everything back up. Beatriz, I say, stopping at the edge of the sidewalk. Yes, Harrison? I need a phone, not to call the police. I need to call someone who owes me a very old, very dangerous debt. I didn't know it yet, but the storm I was about to summon would make the hurricane that took my first shipyard look like a summer breeze. And my children? They were about to learn that you never, ever leave a Thorne for dead. Beatriz's guest house was a small, turquoise-painted cottage tucked away in the hills of Guaynabo, surrounded by thick hibiscus bushes and the constant, rhythmic chirping of the coqui frogs. It was a far cry from the marble-floored mansion I owned in Newport or the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Thorne Maritime. Here, the walls were thin, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the air smelled of strong coffee and damp earth. I sat on the edge of a twin bed with a floral quilt that smelled of lavender and age. Beatriz had given me one of her late husband's old shirts, a faded flannel that was 2 sizes too big, and a pair of drawstring pants. I looked in the small, silver-spotted mirror above the dresser and didn't recognize the man staring back. The titan of industry was gone. In his place was a hollow-eyed ghost, a man who had been discarded by the very people he had spent 40 years protecting. I should have seen it coming. The signs weren't just there. They were screaming at me for years, but I chose to hear only the music. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was back in Newport, 6 months ago, at the annual Thorne Founders Dinner. It was the first one since my wife, Eleanor, had passed away. The house felt too big, the silence too heavy. Eleanor had been the glue, the diplomat, the only one who could look at our children and see through their polished veneers. Without her, the cracks in the family started to show, and they were deeper than I ever dared to admit. Sterling II had been pacing the library that night, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch. He looked more like a predator than a son. "Dad, the market is changing," he had said, his voice cold and clinical. "Shipbuilding is a dinosaur. We need to liquidate the coastal yards and move into automated logistics. I've got a venture capital firm in Singapore ready to buy the Thorne name for 9 figures. I remember the heat rising in my chest. "The Thorne name isn't for sale, Sterling. Those yards employ families who have worked for us for 3 generations. We don't just sell out because you want a faster jet." Victoria had chimed in from the velvet armchair, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness she'd perfected since she was 5. "Oh, Daddy, don't be so dramatic. We just want you to be able to relax. You're 78. You've earned a rest. Why keep struggling with unions and steel prices?" I didn't realize then that rest was their code word for obsolescence. When I refused to sign the liquidation papers, the atmosphere in the house changed. The visits became shorter. The phone calls were always about money. Victoria's charity galas, Garrett's failed tech startups, Sloane's divorce settlements. They viewed my wealth not as a family resource, but as an inheritance that I was selfishly staying alive to spend. "Here," Beatriz said, breaking my reverie. She handed me a cordless phone, an older model that felt heavy in my hand. I managed to get a signal. "Who are you calling, Harrison? Is there a lawyer? A brother?" "No," I whispered. "I'm calling a man who exists in the shadows. A man who knows that a debt to a Thorne is paid in blood or loyalty." I dialed a number I had committed to memory 30 years ago. It was a number that didn't belong to a law firm or a bank. It belonged to Silas, the hammer vein. In the mid-'80s, Silas was a young, ruthless player in the underworld of international shipping. A rival syndicate had rigged his lead freighter to explode in the middle of the Narragansett Bay. I had been on my tugboat that night, testing a new engine. I saw the flash, heard the roar, and I didn't call the Coast Guard first. I dove in. I pulled Silas from the burning wreckage, dragged him onto my deck, and hid him in my shipyard for 3 weeks while his enemies searched the coast for his body. When he finally left, he looked me in the eye and said, "Harrison Thorne, you gave me my life back. If the world ever turns its back on you, call this number. I don't care if it's 20 years or 50, the hammer will strike for you." The phone rang. Once, twice. On the 4th ring, a voice like grinding stones answered. "Speak." "It's Harrison Thorne," I said, my voice steady for the first time since I was abandoned. "The world has turned its back, Silas." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears of a dangerous machine grinding back into life. "I saw the news, Harrison," Silas said. "The disturbed elderly man story. I knew it was a lie the second I saw your name. Where are you?" "San Juan, a guest house in the hills." I have no papers, no money, and my children have stolen my identity. They haven't just stolen it, Silas growled. I've been monitoring the wires. Sterling 2 has already filed an emergency petition in Rhode Island to have you declared legally incompetent. He's using your disappearance in Puerto Rico as proof of a mental break. They're moving fast, Harrison. By the time that ship docks in 3 days, they'll have control of every Thorne asset. The room felt cold. My own son was using my absence, the absence he created, to bury me alive. What happened next, however, was the first twist in a game they didn't know I was playing. Silas, I said, they think I'm an old man who can't operate a smartphone. They think I'm a ghost. I need you to get me to St. Thomas. I have a private vault there that even Eleanor didn't know about. It's the only thing the kids don't have their names on. I can get a fast boat to the coast by midnight, Silas replied. But Harrison, there's something else. I did a deep dive into the Azure Empress manifest. Your son didn't just erase you, he replaced you. Replaced me? There's a man on that ship traveling under the name Harrison Thorne. He hasn't left the suite. The crew thinks you're just a reclusive, sickly old man who stays in bed. When the ship docks, that man will be wheeled off in a wheelchair, head covered, straight into a private ambulance. The world will see Harrison Thorne return home, and then Harrison Thorne will be whisked away to a high-security memory care facility in upstate New York. By the time anyone realizes it isn't you, the paperwork will be ironclad. I nearly dropped the phone. They weren't just abandoning me. They were replacing me with a double to finalize the theft of my life. The level of calculated cruelty was breathtaking. My daughter's smiles, the way she had hugged me before we went to the market, it wasn't just bait. It was a goodbye to a man she had already replaced. How? I whispered. How could they find someone? Money buys everything, Harrison, including a face that looks enough like yours to fool a tired customs officer and a ship's doctor who's been paid to look the other way. Beatriz was watching me, her face etched with worry. I looked at her, then back at my reflection. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, hard resolve that I hadn't felt since I built my first hull. Silas, I said, get the boat, and I need a list. I want to know every debt, every secret, and every offshore account my children think they've hidden. If they want to play with ghosts, I'm going to make sure I'm the one who haunts them. I hung up the phone and looked at Beatriz. I have to leave tonight. You're going to get yourself killed, she said, though there was a spark of admiration in her eyes. I'm already dead, Beatriz. My children murdered the father they had. Now they have to deal with the man I used to be before I became soft enough to love them. I spent the next few hours in a fever of planning. Beatriz helped me find an old leather satchel and filled it with bottled water and some dry rations. She even gave me her late husband's wedding ring, a heavy gold band. Sell this if you have to, she insisted. It's been sitting in a drawer for 10 years. Let it do some good. I took it, promising to return it tenfold. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the San Juan sky in bruised purples and blood reds, I sat on the porch, waiting for the signal Silas had promised. My mind drifted back to Victoria. She was always my favorite. When she was 7, she'd fallen off her bike and scraped her knee. I'd picked her up and she'd looked at me with those big tearful eyes and said, "Daddy, will you always fix everything?" I had promised her I would. And I realized, with a bitter irony, that I was finally keeping that promise. I was going to fix the monsters I had created. Just after midnight, a low, blacked-out powerboat slid into a small, secluded cove, a mile from Beatriz's house. No lights, just the low hum of high-performance engines. A man stepped onto the sand, tall, scarred, wearing a tactical vest. It wasn't Silas, but one of his lieutenants. "Mr. Thorne?" the man asked. "I'm here. The Hammer sends his regards. We're heading for St. Thomas. We have to move." A private security team hired by Thorne Holdings just landed at the airport. They're looking for a confused elderly man. They have orders to protect you and bring you back to the States. "Protect me?" I laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "They're coming to finish the job." I hugged Beatriz one last time. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible," I whispered. "Go, Harrison," she said. "Bring the storm." I stepped onto the boat, the salt spray already hitting my face. The engines roared to life, and we tore across the dark water, leaving Puerto Rico behind. As I looked back at the receding lights of the island, I thought about my son, Sterling, probably sitting in the ship's lounge right now, toast to his brilliant plan. What he didn't know was that I had just reached into the safe in my mind and pulled out the one secret Eleanor and I had kept from them for 40 years. A secret that would turn their legal victory into a pile of ash. The boat hit a swell, and I gripped the railing. My hands didn't shake. The coldness in my heart had turned to ice, and ice is the strongest thing in the world when it's under pressure. Halfway there, "Mr. Thorne," the pilot shouted over the wind. "Good," I replied, staring into the blackness of the ocean. "I want to be waiting for them when they hit the dock. I want to see the look on Victoria's face when she realizes the ghost has come home." But as we neared the coast of St. Thomas, a flare went up in the distance, a bright, blinding red. It wasn't one of ours, and I realized that Silas wasn't the only one who knew how to track a Thorne. The red light of the flare hung in the sky like a bleeding wound, illuminating the dark, choppy waters of the Virgin Passage. It wasn't a distress signal. In the world of high-stakes maritime security, a red flare at that frequency was a marker, a way of saying, "We see you, and you're already caught. Hold on to something, mister." "Thorne!" The pilot, a man Silas called Miller, shouted over the roar of the triple outboards. He slammed the throttles forward. The bow of the blacked-out interceptor lifted, cutting through the swells with a bone-jarring thud. Behind us, 2 sets of high-intensity searchlights snapped on, slicing through the midnight gloom. They were fast, sleek, professional-grade vessels that didn't belong to the local Coast Guard. These were privateers. I didn't know it yet, but my son Sterling hadn't just hired a security team. He had unleashed a pack of wolves I had personally fed and trained years ago. "Who are they?" I yelled, salt spray stinging my eyes. "Blackwood Security Group," Miller shouted back, his eyes glued to the radar sweep. "They're elite, Harrison. Their lead tactical officer is a man named Jax Blackwood. He used to be on your payroll, didn't he?" The name hit me harder than the waves. Jax Blackwood. 10 years ago, I had fired him from Thorne Maritime's port security for using enhanced interrogation on a group of Union strikers. I'd blacklisted him from every reputable firm on the eastern seaboard. Now, it seemed my son had dug him out of the gutter, specifically to hunt me down. It went out of yawn. It was a calculated insult, a way of telling me that my own past was coming back to finish me off. "They're gaining," Miller grunted, banking the boat hard to the left. We were playing a deadly game of tag in the dark. If they caught us, I wouldn't be going to a police station. I'd be found drowned in a tragic accident, a confused old man who fell off a stolen boat. The narrative was already written. All they needed was my body to sign the final page. "Head for the Charlotte Amelie Shoals," I commanded, my old instincts taking over. "The water's too shallow for their draft. If we can get into the reef, we can lose them." "That's suicide in the dark, sir. I built the hulls they're riding in, Miller. I know exactly where their rudders will catch. Trust me, or we're dead anyway." Miller hesitated for a split second, then nodded. He cut the lights, plunging us into total darkness. We were running blind at 40 knots toward a wall of coral and rock. What happened next was the first time in years I felt truly alive. Even as I stared into the mouth of the grave, we hit the shallows. I could hear the coral scraping against our reinforced hull, a sound like screaming metal. Behind us, there was a sickening, catastrophic crunch. One of the Blackwood boats had tried to follow our line. Their deeper V-hull had slammed into a submerged reef head-on. The sound of exploding fiberglass and the sudden silence of a dying engine echoed across the water. The second boat flared its engines, backing off, their searchlights dancing uselessly over the frothing surf. We had bought ourselves 10 minutes, maybe 20. Miller guided us into a hidden inlet near an abandoned coal wharf on the outskirts of St. Thomas. I stepped off the boat, my legs shaking but my mind sharp. I looked back at the darkness. Jax Blackwood was out there, and he wouldn't stop. He was a man fueled by a decade of resentment, and he had my son's checkbook to keep the fire burning. "I can't stay with you, Harrison," Miller said, handing me a small waterproof burner phone. "I have to get this boat back out before the sun comes up. Silas will contact you on this. Stay low." I watched him pull away, leaving me alone in the shadows of the old wharf. I started walking toward an unremarkable brick building that had once been a ship chandler shop in the 1950s. It was a relic of a different era, a place where sailors bought rope and tobacco. It was also the site of the Thorne Primary Reserve. As I walked, I couldn't help but think of my son Garrett. Of all my children, Garrett was the one I worried about the most. He wasn't cruel like Sterling or manipulative like Victoria, he was simply weak. He had spent his life trying to live up to the Thorne name and failing at every turn. His tech startups were black holes for money, and his desperate need for approval made him the perfect pawn. I wondered if Garrett was the one who had finally cracked, if he was the one who had told them about the St. Thomas property. I reached the shop. The windows were boarded up, covered in layers of spray paint and grime. To anyone else, it was an eyesore. To me, it was a fortress. I moved to the back alley, felt for a loose brick behind a rusted drain pipe, and pulled out a heavy old-fashioned brass key. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of cedar and salt. I didn't turn on the lights. I used the flashlight on the burner phone to find the trapdoor beneath a heavy mahogany desk. Below it sat a steel vault, the kind they don't make anymore, 6 inches of solid manganese steel with a manual dial. My fingers were cold, but they remembered the numbers. 140253. The date I met Eleanor. The heavy door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside weren't stacks of gold bars or bundles of cash. There was something far more valuable. There was a black leather binder, a series of encrypted hard drives, and a silver locket. I opened the binder. It was the Eleanor Protocol. My wife had been a brilliant woman, far more cynical about our children's nature than I had been. In the final years of her life, she had seen the rot growing in Sterling and Victoria. She had spent her quiet afternoons gardening, which was actually her code for gathering evidence. She had documented every offshore account they had opened behind my back, every bribe they had paid to local officials to bypass environmental regulations at the shipyards, and every move they had made to undermine my authority. What I found in that safe was more than leverage. It was a death warrant for Sterling's entire career. But then, I saw something that made my breath hitch. Tucked into the back of the binder was a recent photograph. It was a surveillance shot, taken only a month ago. It showed Sterling and Victoria meeting with a man in a dark suit at a private club in Manhattan. I recognized him immediately. Julian Montgomery, the lead counsel for Kensington International, our biggest rival. The betrayal went deeper than I thought. They weren't just trying to take over Thorne Maritime. They were planning to sell the entire company to our enemies, effectively dismantling 45 years of my life to pay off their own mounting debts. They were going to kill the company to save themselves. I thought the vault was my secret, but I'd forgotten that secrets have a way of bleeding through the cracks. I whispered to the empty room. Suddenly, the floorboards above me creaked. My heart hammered against my ribs. I froze, my hand hovering over the silver locket. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate step. Someone was in the shop. They hadn't forced the door. They had been waiting. I reached into the back of the vault and pulled out a small, snub-nosed revolver I'd kept there for 30 years. I checked the cylinder. 5 rounds. I climbed the ladder slowly, my breath shallow. As I emerged from the trapdoor, the silhouette of a man was standing by the mahogany desk. He was tall, wearing a tailored suit that looked wildly out of place in the derelict shop. He was holding a tablet, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. It wasn't Jax Blackwood. It was my lawyer, Arthur Montgomery. He had been my trusted advisor for 3 decades. "Harrison," he said, his voice calm, almost bored. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You always were a creature of habit." "Arthur?" I lowered the gun slightly, my mind reeling. "How did you find this place?" "Only Eleanor and I knew. Eleanor told me many things, Harrison. She trusted me to look after the family's best interests. And right now, the family's best interest involves you staying lost." He stepped closer, and I saw the gleam of a weapon tucked into his waistband. "Sterling is many things, but he's not a visionary. He's impulsive. He wanted to leave you in Puerto Rico and hope for the best. I told him that was sloppy. I told him we needed to be more permanent." "You're working for them?" I asked, the weight of the betrayal feeling like a physical blow. "I made you a partner. I paid for your children's Ivy League tuition. And I've spent 30 years listening to you drone on about integrity and the human touch while the rest of the world moved on to real money," Arthur spat. "Sterling promised me a seat on the board at Kensington once the merger is complete." "It's nothing personal, Harrison. It's just time for the old guard to retire." He raised his tablet, and I saw a live feed on the screen. It was a video of the Azure Empress docking in Miami. The replacement Harrison was being wheeled down the ramp, surrounded by Victoria and Sterling, who were playing the roles of grieving, supportive children to perfection. The press was swarming them. "See?" Arthur said. "The world already has its Harrison Thorne. You're just a ghost in a basement now." He reached for his gun, but he was arrogant. He thought a 78-year-old man was a target, not a threat. What he didn't know was that while I had spent years building ships, I had also spent my youth in the Navy, learning exactly how to handle a man who underestimates his opponent. I didn't fire the gun. I threw the heavy leather binder at his face. The weight of it caught him off guard, the corner of the binder clipping his temple. He stumbled back, his shot going wide and shattering a dusty glass jar of ship's biscuits. I lunged forward, not with the strength of a young man, but with the desperation of a man who has nothing left to lose. I drove my shoulder into his chest, slamming him against the wall. He gasped, the air leaving his lungs. I pressed the barrel of the revolver against his throat, the Eleanor protocol. I hissed in his ear. She didn't just document the kids, Arthur. She documented you, every kickback, every falsified contract, every favored deal you brokered for Kensington. If I die, that binder is already set to be delivered to the federal prosecutor. It was a bluff. The binder was right there on the floor, but his eyes widened in genuine terror. He knew Eleanor. He knew she was thorough. Harrison, wait. Give me the tablet, I commanded. I snatched the device from his shaking hand. I looked at the screen. The replacement Harrison was being loaded into an ambulance. I saw Victoria dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I saw Sterling looking at his watch, his face a mask of cold efficiency. And then, I saw something Arthur had missed. In the background of the live news feed, standing near the edge of the police cordon, was a woman. She was wearing a nurse's uniform, but she was looking directly at the camera. She held up a small hand-drawn sign for only 3 seconds before disappearing into the crowd. The sign had a single word on it: Beatriz. My heart leaped. I wasn't as alone as I thought. Beatriz hadn't just given me a place to stay. She had followed the ship. She was in Miami. I looked back at Arthur, who was slumped against the wall, clutching his chest. You're going to help me get on a private flight to Miami, Arthur, right now. Or I'll see how permanent your career looks from a prison cell. I didn't know it yet, but the trap I was about to set for my children in Miami would make the shoals of St. Thomas look like a kiddie pool. They wanted a show. I was going to give them the performance of a lifetime. The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 was silent, save for the low, expensive hum of the twin engines as we leveled out at 40,000 feet. It was a plane I had paid for a gift to Sterling II on his 40th birthday. Now, I was a stowaway in my own life, sitting in the buttery leather seat across from Arthur Montgomery, who was nursing a bruised temple and a glass of vintage scotch he'd poured with trembling hands. You can't win this, Harrison, Arthur whispered, his eyes darting toward the cockpit. Sterling has the board, he has the political connections in Miami. You're flying into a fortress. I built that fortress, Arthur, I said, my voice cold and rhythmic, matching the vibration of the plane. I know where the cracks are. And I know you're going to help me crawl through them. I didn't know it yet, but my children's plan had a second layer, a darker, more desperate motive than just corporate greed. As we soared over the dark expanse of the Atlantic, I forced Arthur to open his encrypted laptop. He resisted until I leaned in, the cold barrel of the revolver brushing against his knee. He began to type. Files flickered across the screen: ledgers, wire transfers, and internal memos from Kensington International. My eyes narrowed as I read. Sterling hadn't just been trying to sell the company. He had already embezzled nearly $60 million from the Thorne Maritime Pension Fund to cover a series of disastrous bets on offshore crypto mining projects. If the company went under or was audited before the merger, he wasn't just losing his job, he was going to federal prison for the rest of his life. What I found next made my stomach churn. Victoria wasn't just a silent partner in this. She was the one who had brokered the deal with the replacement. I stared at a scan of a passport in the files. The man being wheeled through Miami right now wasn't just a lookalike. His name was Elias Thorne. He was my younger brother's son, my nephew, who had been estranged from the family for 20 years after a scandal involving grand larceny. Elias? I whispered, the betrayal tasting like copper in my mouth. They brought Elias back? He was desperate, Harrison, Arthur muttered, looking away. He's a ghost, just like you. Sterling promised him $10 million and a new life in South America once the papers were signed. He has your gait, your height, and enough of the Thorne bone structure to pass through a crowd. My own flesh and blood. My children had gone into the shadows of our family tree to find someone to bury me. They had turned my nephew into a weapon against me. The open loop in my mind finally closed. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively replacing me to erase the evidence of their crimes. We're descending. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Arthur looked at me, a desperate glint in his eye. If we land at the private terminal, Jack's Blackwood's men will be there. They'll take you, Harrison. and I won't be able to stop them. Then we aren't landing at the private terminal, I said. I grabbed the headset. Pilot, change of plans. Divert to the Opalaka Executive Airport. Tell them we have a mechanical issue and need a discreet hangar. Sir, Mr. Sterling's orders are, I'm the man whose name is on the tail of this plane, I barked, the authority of 40 years of command returning to my voice. Do as you're told or I'll make sure you never fly anything larger than a paper airplane again. 10 minutes later, we touched down on a rain-slicked runway far from the glitz of Miami Beach. As the stairs lowered, a battered silver SUV pulled up to the hangar. The driver door opened, and Beatriz Ortega stepped out. She wasn't wearing her floral dress anymore. She was in a dark windbreaker and baseball cap, looking every bit like the veteran principal who had handled 1,000 schoolyard brawls. Beatriz? I asked, stepping off the plane while keeping Arthur firmly in my grip. How did you get here? I have a brother who flies cargo from San Juan to Miami, she said, her eyes scanning the perimeter. I told him I had a friend in trouble. Harrison, you're all over the news. They've moved the replacement to the Mercer Medical Center. They're calling it a private recovery wing. It's a cage, Harrison. High security. I need to get in there, I said. It's not just security, Beatriz warned. Victoria is there. She's playing the devoted daughter, sitting by his bed 12 hours a day. She's holding a press conference in 2 hours to announce your, or rather, Elias's retirement and the voluntary transfer of all voting rights to Sterling. The humiliation burned. They were going to use a fake version of me to sign away the lives of 300 workers. I had to move, but I was an old man with a traitorous lawyer and a school principal against a private army. Arthur, I said, turning to the lawyer, you're going to call Victoria. You're going to tell her that you found me in St. Thomas, but that I'm dead. Tell her you disposed of the problem, but you need her to meet you at the Mercer loading dock to sign off on the final payment for Blackwood. Arthur's face went white. She'll know I'm lying. She can hear it in my voice. Then you'd better give the performance of your life, I said, shoving the phone into his hand. Because if you don't, I'll hand this tablet to the officer at the gate and tell him exactly what's on it. Arthur's hand shook as he dialed. I watched his face as the line connected. Victoria? It's Arthur. It's done. The old man he's gone. He didn't make it out of the wharf. No witnesses, but I need to see you. The Blackwood team is demanding a wire transfer before the press conference, or they're walking. I'm at the Mercer loading dock, 10 minutes. He hung up, sweat beads rolling down his forehead. She's coming. We piled into Beatriz's SUV. As we drove toward the city, the neon skyline of Miami felt like a shimmering, hollow lie. I checked the revolver in my pocket. I hadn't fired a gun in years, and I hoped I wouldn't have to. What I was looking for wasn't a body count. It was a confession. We reached the Mercer Medical Center, a glass and steel monolith that hummed with the sound of silent, expensive machinery. We pulled into the shadows of the loading bay. Beatriz stayed in the car, her eyes on the mirrors. I stayed in the back seat, hidden behind the tinted glass, with Arthur sitting in the front, looking like a man waiting for his own funeral. A sleek black sedan pulled up minutes later. The door opened, and Victoria stepped out. She looked stunning, a charcoal gray suit, hair perfectly coiffed, her face a mask of practiced, somber elegance. She looked exactly like the daughter a grieving public would trust. She walked up to Arthur's window, her expression sharp. You're late, Arthur, and you look terrible. Is it done? Is he really gone? He's gone, Victoria, Arthur said, his voice cracking. Good, she said, and for the first time, I saw the true monster beneath the skin. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She smiled a small, chilling upturn of the lips. He was always so stubborn, he never knew when to let go. Honestly, it's a mercy. Now, where are the Blackwood documents? Sterling wants this wrapped before the 6 o'clock news. The documents are in the back, Arthur said. Victoria reached for the rear door handle. She pulled it open, expecting a briefcase. Instead, she found me. The blood drained from her face so fast she had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I sat there in the shadows, the ghost she thought was buried in a Caribbean wharf. Hello, Victoria, I said softly. You forgot the first rule of the shipyard. Never count a hull as sunk until you've seen the bubbles stop. Daddy, she whispered, the word sounding like a curse. Don't call me that, I said, stepping out of the car. I didn't raise the gun. I didn't have to. The look in my eyes was enough to make her stagger back. I know about the pension fund, I know about Elias, and I know about the merger. She recovered quickly, too quickly. Her eyes darted around the loading dock, looking for an exit. "You're delusional. You're a confused old man who wandered off a ship." "Nobody will believe you. We have doctors, Harrison. We have a man upstairs who has your fingerprints and your DNA on file." "My DNA?" I laughed. Sterling was always clever, but he's sloppy. "You can fake a face, Victoria. You can even fake a signature. But you can't fake the Eleanor Protocol." I held up the black binder. "Inside this is the original deed to the Thorne Maritime Trust. It's a physical document, Victoria. The only one that matters. And the only way to transfer it is with a biometric key that is tied to a safe in this city, one that only I can open." It was the second bluff of the night, but it worked. She froze. "Where is Sterling?" I demanded. "He's at the penthouse," she stammered, her composure finally shattering. "He's preparing the final signing." "Call him," I said. "Tell him the ghost is at the door. And tell him that if he doesn't meet me at the boardroom in 30 minutes, the entire world is going to find out that the Thorne they're about to invest in is a hollowed-out shell." What happened next changed everything. Victoria's phone buzzed in her hand. She looked at the screen, and her eyes went wide with a different kind of fear. "What is it?" I asked. "It's Jax Blackwood," she whispered. He's at the hospital. He's in the room with Elias. He says there's been a change in the contract. He's demanding 50% of the merger payout, or he's going to the press right now." The wolf had turned on the pack. My son had hired a monster to kill his father, and now the monster was hungry for the children too. "Get in the car, Victoria," I said, opening the door. "Where are we going?" "We're going to save your life," I said, "so that I can be the one who takes everything else away from you." I didn't know it yet, but the final reversal was already in motion. We weren't just going to a boardroom. We were going to a slaughterhouse, and Jax Blackwood was already sharpening the knives. The drive from the Mercer Medical Center to the Thorne Tower penthouse was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Victoria sat huddled against the far door of the SUV, her breath fogging the window. She looked small, stripped of the practiced arrogance that usually draped over her like a mink coat. Every time I looked at her, I didn't see the woman who had left me to rot in a Puerto Rican alleyway. I saw the little girl who used to hide in the shipyard's tool shed when she was scared of the thunder. It made the anger in my gut feel like cold, jagged glass. "Why, Victoria?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper above the hum of the tires. "I gave you everything. Every trust fund, every vacation, every safety net. Was it really not enough?" She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the rain-slicked neon of Biscayne Boulevard. "It was never about the money for me, Dad. Not at first. But Sterling, he made it seem so easy. He said you were living in a dream world, holding on to a dying industry while we were drowning in debt. We were Thornes by name, but we were beggars in private. Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep up the life you taught us to want?" "I taught you to build things," I snapped. "I didn't teach you to be parasites. You taught us that the Thorne name was the most powerful thing in the world," she countered, her voice finally finding a spark of its old venom. "But you kept the keys to the vault. You stayed in that office, year after year, healthy as an ox, while we waited. We're in our 50s, Harrison. We were tired of waiting for our lives to start." I didn't know it yet, but the life she was so eager to start was already being dismantled by the very man she had hired to protect it. We pulled into the private underground garage of the Thorne Tower. Arthur Montgomery was shaking so hard he could barely put the car in park. Beatrice sat in the front seat, her hand resting on the holster of a small stun gun she'd taken from my nephew's security detail earlier. She looked at me in the rearview mirror, her amber eyes steady. "This is the lion's den, Harrison," she said. "Are you sure about this?" "I built the den, Beatrice. I know where the trapdoors are." We took the private elevator straight to the 50th floor. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime into a world of white marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and the cold, hushed silence of absolute wealth. Sterling, too, was standing by the window, a silhouette against the flickering lightning of the Miami skyline. He was holding a remote, likely checking the final stock tickers before the merger news broke. He didn't turn around when he heard the elevator. "Victoria, is the press conference prepped?" "Arthur, I want the final signing in 10 minutes. Elias is being prepped for the photo op." "Elias isn't coming, Sterling," I said. The remote dropped from his hand, clattering against the marble. Sterling froze. It took him 5 full seconds to turn around, and when he did, his face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked at me, then at Victoria, then at the bruised and broken Arthur. "Dad," he choked out. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," I said. stepping into the center of the room. I let the light hit the black binder in my hand. But a Thorne ghost is a hard thing to lay to rest, especially when you've left the shovel in his hand. Sterling regained his composure with a speed that was almost admirable. He straightened his silk tie, his eyes darting to the security console on his desk. "I don't know how you got here, but you're trespassing. You're legally incompetent, Harrison. The papers were filed this morning. Security will be here in 60 seconds to escort you back to the medical facility for your evaluation." "The papers Arthur filed?" I asked, glancing at the lawyer. "The ones based on the lie that I was wandering the streets of San Juan with dementia? I think a judge might find it interesting that I'm standing here perfectly lucid, with the evidence of your $60 million pension embezzlement in my hand." Sterling's eyes flickered to Arthur. The betrayal in the room was so thick you could taste it. "Arthur, what did you do?" "He did what a rat always does when the ship starts to sink, Sterling," I said. "He chose the side with the biggest lifeboat. What happened next was the twist I hadn't anticipated the moment the hunters became the prey." A heavy, thudding sound echoed from the hallway. The double doors of the penthouse didn't open. They were kicked inward. Jax Blackwood stepped into the room. He was a massive man, smelling of expensive cigars and cheap violence. He wasn't alone. Two of his men followed, carrying a limp, unconscious figure between them. They dropped the body onto the marble floor. It was Elias Thorne, the replacement. He was covered in bruises, his expensive suit torn. The replacement had a loose tongue. Jax growled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. He looked at Sterling with a predatory grin. "He told me all about the pension fund. He told me that if this merger goes through, you stand to make $400 million. And here I was, working for a measly $2 million retainer. I think my fee just went up." Sterling backed away, his hands raised. "Jax, we have a contract. I'll double it, $5 million. "I'm thinking 50%, Jax said, pulling a serrated combat knife from his belt and casually cleaning his fingernails. "And I'm thinking I don't need the Thorne children to sign the papers. I have the Harrison right here." He gestured to the unconscious Elias. "Once he wakes up, he'll sign whatever I tell him to. And if the real Harrison happens to have a stroke right here in the penthouse, well, that's just a tragedy of old age, isn't it?" The room went ice cold. My children, in their infinite greed, had brought a monster into our home, and now the monster was going to eat us all. Victoria let out a sob, clutching my arm. Sterling looked like he was about to vomit. "Jax," I said, stepping forward. "I didn't show the gun yet. You remember me. I'm the man who broke your career 10 years ago." "I remember," Jax hissed, his eyes locking onto mine with a burning hatred. "I've been dreaming of this day, Harrison. The great Titan, brought low by his own greedy pups. I'm going to enjoy watching you realize that all your ships and all your steel can't save you from 6 inches of cold metal." "You're right," I said. "Steel can't save me, but logic can." I opened the black binder. "You think Elias can sign those papers?" "The Kensington merger requires a biometric verification linked to the Thorne maritime mainframe. Elias has my face, Jax. He might even have a copy of my fingerprints. But he doesn't have the subdermal chip I had implanted in my wrist 5 years ago when we went to high-security naval contracts. Without my physical arm over that scanner, the merger is a pile of worthless digital ink." Jax paused, his knife hovering. He looked at Sterling. "Is that true?" Sterling looked at me, bewildered. I didn't know about a chip." "Of course you didn't," I said. "You were too busy looking at the balance sheets to look at the security protocols. I'm the only one who can unlock the merger. And I'm the only one who can prove you've been stealing from the men who built this company." I didn't know it yet, but I was about to play the most dangerous card in the deck, a card that would either save my family or destroy us all in the next 10 seconds. "Here's the deal, Jax," I said, my voice steady. "You let my children go. They're pathetic, but they're still mine. You take Arthur and the 60 million sterling hid in the Cayman accounts. I've already unlocked the transfers in the elevator. You disappear, and I won't call the authorities for 24 hours. And what do I get?" Sterling screamed. "That's my money." "You're giving away my future." "Your future is a prison cell, Sterling," I roared, finally losing my temper. "I'm trying to keep you from a body bag." Jax looked at the tablet Arthur was holding. He saw the numbers, the 60 million ready to move. It was a bird in the hand versus a $400 million bird in a very dangerous bush. He was a mercenary. He knew when to take the win. "The old man is smarter than all of you combined." Jax laughed, gesturing for his men to lower their weapons. "Fine, give me the codes for the Caymans. We take the lawyer as insurance. But Harrison, If those funds don't clear by the time we hit the garage, my men come back up here and turn this penthouse into a slaughterhouse. I watched as Arthur was dragged out, whimpering. Jax gave me one last, lingering look of malice before disappearing into the elevator. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood in the middle of the room, the binder heavy in my hand. Sterling collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Victoria was shaking, her makeup ruined by tears, but the loop wasn't closed. Not even close. "Is it true?" Sterling asked, his voice muffled. "The biometric chip? You really had one?" I looked at my wrist. There was no chip. I'd never had one. It was the third and final bluff. "No, Sterling," I said. "But I knew you were too arrogant to check, and I knew Jax was too greedy to risk losing 60 million for a chance at 400. I walked over to the desk and picked up the remote Sterling had dropped. I pressed a button, and the wall monitors flickered to life. They weren't showing stock tickers. They were showing a live feed of the garage. I saw Jax and his men pile into their black SUV. I saw them pull toward the exit. And then, I saw the blue and red lights. Dozens of them. The Miami PD tactical unit had the entire block surrounded. Beatriz hadn't just been watching the mirrors. She had been on the phone with the Federal Bureau of Investigation the moment we entered the building. The transfer I'd initiated wasn't to a Cayman account, it was a traceable wire trap set up by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "It's over," I said, watching as Jax Blackwood was dragged from his vehicle in handcuffs. "For Jax, for Arthur, and for you." Sterling looked up, his eyes wide. "Dad, please, you can't let them take us. We're your children. You stopped being my children the moment you chose a stranger to take my place," I said. What I said next was the final blow, the one that would ensure they never forgot the name Harrison Sterling Thorne. "I'm not calling the police on you, Sterling. Not for the abandonment. I don't need to. I've already contacted the board of directors. I've handed over the Eleanor protocol. They're voting right now to remove you and Victoria from the company, effective immediately. Your shares are being seized to repay the pension fund you robbed." I leaned over the desk, looking my son in the eye. "You wanted to be Thorns without the work. Now, you're just Sterling and Victoria. No company, no money, no legacy. You're going to walk out of this building with nothing but the clothes on your backs and the shame of what you tried to do to your father." Victoria stood up, her voice trembling. "Where will we go? We have nothing." "You have the same thing you gave me in San Juan," I said. "The world. I hope it's kinder to you than you were to me." I turned my back on them and walked toward the elevator. Beatriz was waiting for me. We stepped inside, and as the doors began to close, I saw my children standing in the middle of their crumbling empire, realizing for the first time that the old man they tried to erase was the only thing that had been holding their world together. I didn't know it yet, but as I hit the lobby, a final message would appear on my phone, one that would prove that even in the depths of betrayal, there was one Thorne who hadn't forgotten what family meant. The elevator descent was a silent, agonizing plunge. I watched the floor numbers tick down on the sleek digital display, 50, 49, 48, each one a heartbeat in a life I had reclaimed but no longer recognized. Beside me, Beatriz stood with her hands folded, her gaze fixed forward. She didn't offer platitudes. She knew that winning a war against your own children doesn't feel like victory. It feels like standing in the middle of a burnt-out field, holding a handful of ash. When the doors opened into the lobby, the world exploded. Flushes from 100 cameras turned the marble atrium into a strobing nightmare. Reporters from every major network were held back by a thin line of private security and Miami PD. They had been tipped off not by me and not by Beatriz, but by the sheer gravitational pull of a Thorne scandal. "Mr. Thorne, Harrison, is it true you were abandoned? Is Sterling Thorne II under arrest? Who is the man in the hospital?" I didn't stop. I walked through them like a prow of a ship through heavy fog, my face a mask of iron. I felt Beatriz's hand on my elbow, guiding me toward a waiting black car. Just as I reached the door, my burner phone, the one Silas had given me, vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a tactical update from the Hammer. Instead, it was a message from a number I didn't recognize. "I stayed in my room like you told me, Grandpa, but I saw them take your things. I hid the little silver box in my backpack. I'm at the back gate of the estate. Please come." My heart, which I thought had turned to stone in the penthouse, shattered all over again. It was Leo, my grandson, the only innocent soul in that house of vipers. He hadn't just been a witness, he had been a victim of their silence. I didn't know it yet, but that little silver box held the one piece of the puzzle Sterling and Victoria had been willing to kill for. "Change of plans, Beatriz," I said, my voice thick. "We're going to the Star Island estate. Now." The drive across the causeway felt like an eternity. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the kind that hides the horizon and makes the world feel small. When we reached the gates of the Thorne estate, a $20 million fortress of limestone and glass, the lights were off. It looked like a tomb. I saw him huddled under the eaves of the gatehouse, a small, shivering figure in a soaked hoodie. "Leo." I practically jumped out of the moving car. "Leo." He ran to me, his small arms wrapping around my waist with a strength that nearly knocked the wind out of me. He was sobbing, his face buried in my damp shirt. "I thought you were dead, Grandpa. Uncle Sterling told me you fell in the water and the sharks got you. He told me if I said anything to the police, the sharks would come for me too." The rage that surged through me then was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a businessman. It was the primal fury of a patriarch. Sterling hadn't just abandoned me. He had traumatized a child to protect his secret. "You're safe now, Leo," I whispered, smoothing his wet hair. "The sharks are in cages tonight." He pulled back, his eyes red-rimmed and fierce. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, tarnished silver box. I recognized it immediately. It was the music box I'd given Eleanor on our 25th anniversary. It didn't play music anymore. The gears had rusted years ago. I saw Aunt Victoria trying to smash it on the floor the night before we left for the cruise, Leo said, his voice trembling. "She was looking for a key. I swapped it for a different box from the attic when she wasn't looking. I knew it was important because she looked. She looked like a monster when she was holding it." I took the box. My fingers found the hidden catch, the one Eleanor had shown me in the hospital during her final hours. I pressed it, and the bottom of the box clicked open. Inside was a micro SD card and a handwritten note in Eleanor's elegant script. "For Harrison, when you finally stop choosing to be blind." Beatriz walked up behind us, sheltering Leo with her coat. "What is it?" "The truth," I said. We went inside. The house felt haunted. I could still smell Victoria's expensive perfume in the foyer and hear the ghost of Sterling's arrogant laughter in the den. I went to my study, plugged the card into my computer, and waited. Files began to populate the screen. But they weren't about money. They were medical records. My breath hitched as I scrolled through the data. The hidden truth finally revealed itself, and it was a reversal that made everything I thought I knew about my family seem like a fairy tale. According to the records, Eleanor hadn't died of natural causes. She had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of early-onset dementia 2 years before she passed. But the records showed something else: her medication was being tampered with. The dosages were tripled, then halved, then skipped entirely. The signatures on the pharmacy logs weren't hers, they were Victoria's, and the motive wasn't just to hurry along an inheritance. Eleanor had discovered that Sterling and Victoria weren't my biological children. I stared at the screen, the room spinning. 40 years of fatherhood. I remembered the nights I stayed up with Sterling when he had the croup. I remembered walking Victoria down the aisle at her first wedding, my chest bursting with pride. The documents were clear. Kensington International, our rival company, had been run by a man named Montgomery Sterling Sr. 40 years ago. He and Eleanor had a history, a brief, desperate affair during a summer I had spent overseas building a fleet for the Greek government. She had never told me. She had raised them as thorns. But Sterling and Victoria had found out. They had found the DNA tests Eleanor had hidden. I wasn't their father. I was their obstacle. They had been working for Kensington not just for the money, but because they felt they were finally returning to their real family. They viewed my empire as something they were entitled to loot from a man who wasn't even their blood. "Harrison?" Beatrice's voice was soft, concerned. I couldn't speak. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Everything I had built, every shipyard, every ship, every memory was a lie. I was a cuckold who had spent his life enriching the offspring of his greatest enemy. They knew. I finally rasped. "They've known for years. That's why they didn't care if I died in that alley. To them, I wasn't just a nuisance. I was the man who had stolen their mother from their true father." The irony was a jagged blade in my heart. Sterling had named himself Sterling too, not after me, but after the man Eleanor had loved in secret. "What are you going to do?" Beatrice asked. I looked at the silver box. I looked at Leo, who was curled up on the sofa, finally asleep. He was Garrett's son. I checked the files again, my heart in my throat. Garrett, my weak, tech-failing son. I scrolled through the DNA results Eleanor had compiled. My eyes scanned the names. Garrett was mine. He was the only one. The one I had treated with the most disappointment. The one I had called weak, because he didn't have the shark-like instincts of his siblings. I had favored the monsters because they looked like me, or so I thought, and I had pushed away the only true Thorne I had left. I have to find Garrett, I said, standing up with a renewed, desperate purpose. He didn't come to the cruise. They told me he was too busy with a new startup in Seattle, but he hasn't answered my calls in weeks. Harrison, look at the bottom of the file list, Beatrice pointed out. There was a folder labeled The Basement. I opened it. It contained a series of frantic emails between Sterling and Victoria from 3 weeks ago. Garrett is becoming a problem. He found the DNA files. He's threatening to tell the old man. We can't let him leave the Seattle house. Blackwood has him under supervision until the merger is finalized. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had kidnapped their own brother, my only son, to keep the secret buried. I didn't know it yet, but my revenge plan was no longer about money or the company. It was a rescue mission, and I was going to use every shadow Silas Vane could provide to tear down the world my children had built. I picked up the phone and dialed Silas. Silas, I need a strike team. Not for a ship, for a residential address in Seattle. And Silas? Yeah, Harrison? Tell them to bring the heavy gear. I'm done being the disturbed old man. I'm the man who builds the things that don't break. And tonight I'm going to break everything they love. I hung up and looked at Beatrice. Take Leo to your brother's place. Keep him safe. I'm going to Seattle. You're 78, Harrison, she said, though she was already grabbing her keys. Then it's a good thing I've had 78 years to learn how to wait for the right moment to strike. As I walked out of the house, I didn't look back at the limestone walls or the glass balconies. They were just stone and sand. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. The reversal was complete. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their downfall. I didn't know it yet, but as I boarded the private jet for Seattle, Sterling was making one final, desperate move. He wasn't going to let me reach Garrett. He had one more card to play, a card that involved a police report, a fabricated crime, and a warrant for my arrest that was being signed at that very moment. The descent into Seattle-Tacoma International was a blur of charcoal clouds and a relentless, misty rain that seemed to dissolve the very edges of the world. I sat in the back of a nondescript black SUV, my eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. Every light in the city looked like a smear of neon grease. I felt heavier than I ever had in my 78 years, not with age, but with the crushing weight of the truth. 40 years of pride. 40 years of thinking I was passing my blood and my fire to Sterling and Victoria. It had all been a hollow stage play. I had spent my life building a castle for children who weren't mine, while the one true Thorne, my quiet, struggling Garrett, had been pushed into the shadows. I had called him weak because he didn't share the predatory glint in Sterling's eyes. I didn't know it yet, but that weakness was actually the only piece of human decency left in the Thorne lineage. We're 3 miles out from the Queen Anne safe house, the driver said. He was one of Silas Vane's men, a silent professional named Garrett Miller, an ironic coincidence that made my chest tighten. Silas's tactical team is already in position. They're reporting 4 Blackwood contractors on site. They're armed, Mr. Thorne. This isn't a boardroom meeting. I don't want them dead, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I want them incapacitated, and I want my son. But as we turned onto a steep tree-lined street, my burner phone chirped. It was a news alert, the kind that pierces through the silence like a siren. Breaking. Nationwide manhunt for disgraced shipbuilder Harrison Thorne. Authorities seek Thorne in connection to a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme and the alleged assault of his legal counsel in St. Thomas. I stared at the screen. Sterling had finally played his final card. He had twisted the Eleanor Protocol evidence, likely using Arthur Montgomery's forced confession to frame me for the very crimes he had committed. To the world, I wasn't just a confused old man anymore. I was a fugitive financier, a dangerous relic trying to burn down his own company before he was caught. The loop was tightening around my neck. I had less than an hour before every patrol car in the Pacific Northwest was looking for this SUV. Step on it, I commanded. We pulled up to a secluded mid-century modern house tucked behind a wall of overgrown ivy. It looked like a luxury prison. The lights were dim, but I could see the silhouettes of men moving behind the glass. This was where they had hidden my only son. Silas's lead man, a scarred veteran named Vane, a cousin of Silas's, I presumed, tapped on my window. He handed me an earpiece. We're going in through the garage and the kitchen simultaneously. We have flashbangs and non-lethal rounds. You stay in the car until we give the clear signal. Like hell I will, I said, stepping out into the cold rain. The chill soaked through my coat, but I didn't feel it. The adrenaline was a hot, buzzing wire in my veins. That's my son in there. The raid was over in less than 90 seconds when there were muffled pops, the sound of breaking glass, and a series of sharp, authoritative shouts. One Blackwood guard was thrown through the front door, gasping as he hit the wet pavement. Vane signaled me with a quick flash of his light. I ran inside. The house smelled of stale takeout and fear. I pushed past a fallen guard and ran down a narrow hallway toward a door that was reinforced with a heavy deadbolt. Vane kicked it open. I stopped in the doorway, my heart nearly stopping. Garrett was sitting on a bare mattress in the corner of a windowless room. He looked terrible. He'd lost 20 pounds. His beard was overgrown and ragged, and his hands were shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his arms. When the light hit him, he winced, shielding his eyes. "Garrett?" I whispered. He looked up, and for a second I saw his mother's face in the set of his jaw. He didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with a profound, weary relief. "Dad?" he rasped. Is it really you? Or is this another one of Sterling's head games?" I crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled him into my arms. He was skin and bone, smelling of unwashed clothes and the metallic tang of chronic stress. I held him like I hadn't held him since he was a toddler. "It's me, Garrett. I'm so sorry. God, I am so sorry. They told me you were dead, Dad." He sobbed into my shoulder. "They said the ship went down in a storm, and I was the only one left to sign the transfer papers. They've been drugging me, trying to get me to sign over my shares in the trust. They knew I was the only one who could stop the merger because of the way Mom structured the inheritance." I pulled back, holding his face in my hands. "I know everything, Garrett. I know about the DNA. I know you're the only Thorne I have left." He froze, his amber eyes searching mine. "You found the files? Then you know. You know Sterling and Victoria aren't?" "I know," I said, the word like a vow. "And I'm going to make them wish they'd never heard our name." I didn't know it yet, but our reunion was about to be interrupted by a betrayal I hadn't seen coming, a knife in the dark from the person I trusted most in this rescue. As we prepared to leave, Vane stepped into the room. He wasn't looking at the guards. He was looking at me, and he was holding a suppressed pistol. "Sorry, Mr. Thorne," Vane said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But Silas is a businessman. And Sterling just offered him a deal that beats yours by 20 million. Plus a permanent seat on the Port Authority board once the Kensington merger is finalized." I felt the air leave the room. Silas, my hammer, my old friend. He had sold me out for a seat at the table. I had built my life on loyalty, and in the end, I was being dismantled by the very man I had saved from a burning ship. "Silas wouldn't do this," I said, though I could feel the truth of it in the coldness of Vane's gaze. "Silas has a lot of mouths to feed, Harrison," Vane said, "and you're a ghost with a warrant out for his arrest. It's much easier to collect a bounty on a fugitive than a debt from a man who's about to lose everything." He gestured with the gun. "Both of you, back in the SUV. We're taking you back to the airport. Sterling is waiting in Miami. He wants to be there when you peacefully surrender to the authorities. It'll make for a great headline." We were marched out into the rain. I looked at Garrett, who was stumbling beside me, his spirit finally broken. I felt a surge of cold, focused clarity. I had been playing the game with the rules of the old world: loyalty, debt, honor. But I was in a den of wolves now. What Vane didn't know, and what Silas had forgotten, is that I didn't just build ships. I built the systems that governed them, and I always built a kill switch. As we reached the SUV, I tripped. It was a clumsy old man fall, splashing into a deep puddle. Vane swore, reaching down to grab my collar. "Get up, you old." I didn't get up. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small silver music box Leo had given me. I didn't open the hidden compartment. I pressed the rusted wind-up key twice, then once, then twice again. It wasn't just a music box. It was an old-school short-range signal jammer Eleanor had commissioned from a private security firm years ago. She'd been paranoid, but her paranoia was my salvation. The device emitted a high-frequency burst that fried the electronics in Vane's earpiece and jammed the GPS trackers on the SUV. Vane shrieked, clutching his ear as the feedback hit his brain. In that split second of distraction, I didn't go for his gun. I went for his throat. I drove my forearm into his windpipe, using my body weight to pin him against the side of the vehicle. Garrett, seeing the opening, found a spark of the Thorne fire. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the guard's belt and swung it with everything he had, catching Vane across the temple. The mercenary went down like a sack of stones. We didn't wait. We piled into a secondary car, the one the guards had used, and I floored it, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. "Where are we going, Dad?" Garrett asked, gasping for air. "The police are looking for you. Silas is hunting us." "We have nowhere to go." "We're going to the one place Sterling will never look," I said, my hand steady on the wheel. "We're going to the Kensington International headquarters in downtown Seattle." "Why there?" "That's the enemy." "No, Garrett," I said, a grim smile touching my lips. "That's the scene of the crime, and I'm going to make sure the world is watching when I walk through the front door." I didn't know it yet, but my plan was no longer about hiding. It was about a scorched earth revelation. I had the Eleanor protocol. I had the DNA. I had the heir. And in 30 minutes, I was going to broadcast the rot of the Thorne and Kensington families to every news outlet on the planet. As we sped toward the skyline, I saw the blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. They were closing in. The warrant was active. The city was a trap. "Dad, they're going to arrest you," Garrett cried. "Let them," I said. "A court of law is the only place left where the truth can't be deleted." But as we approached the Kensington building, a black sedan slammed into our side, spinning us across 3 lanes of traffic. The airbags deployed with a deafening thud. I tasted blood. Through the haze of the smoke, I saw a figure stepping out of the sedan. It was Sterling too. He wasn't in Miami. He had come to finish the job himself. He walked toward our smoking car, a pistol in his hand and a look of cold, murderous resolve on his face. "It ends here, Harrison," he shouted over the rain. "I'm taking back what's mine." I looked at Garrett, who was unconscious in the passenger seat. I looked at the binder in my lap. The final reversal was here. I had to reach the lobby. I had to trigger the broadcast. I pushed the door open, the metal groaning. I stepped out, the old man standing against the son who wasn't his. "You're not a Thorne, Sterling," I said, my voice carrying over the wind. "You're just a thief in a silk suit. And the lights are about to come on." I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about who would win. It was about who would survive the truth. The world was a kaleidoscope of shattered glass and freezing rain. I crawled from the wreckage of the car, the taste of copper thick in my mouth. My left arm felt like it had been struck by a sledgehammer, dangling uselessly at my side. But the black binder, the Eleanor protocol, was still clutched in my right hand. I looked back at the passenger seat. Garrett was stirring, his forehead gashed by the glass, his eyes unfocused. "Stay down, son," I croaked. "Just stay down." Sterling, too, was 20 feet away, the rain slicking back his hair, making him look like a drowned rat in an expensive suit. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. The pistol in his hand was shaking, the barrel weaving as he tried to aim through the downpour. "Give it to me, Harrison," he screamed, his voice cracking against the wind. "The binder. Give it to me and I'll let the ambulance take him. I'll tell the police it was a kidnapping gone wrong. You can disappear. You can go back to your little island and die in peace." I stood my ground, my legs trembling, my vision blurring. Behind him, the glass doors of Kensington International stood like a silent, indifferent judge. High above us, the digital ticker on the building's facade was scrolling through stock prices. Thorne Maritime was down 30%. The world was already smelling the blood in the water. "You're not going to shoot me, Sterling," I said, stepping forward. Each step felt like walking through deep, heavy mud. "Because if you do, the signal I've already set up with Beatrice will trigger. Every major news desk in the country will receive the raw files, the DNA, the pharmacy logs, the embezzlement. You won't just be a thief, you'll be a murderer on live television." I didn't know it yet, but Sterling wasn't the only one who had come to Seattle to ensure the Thorne name died tonight. A second car pulled up, tires screeching. The door flew open, and Victoria stepped out. She wasn't the polished princess I'd raised. She was wearing a trench coat over pajamas, her face haggard, her eyes wild with a frantic, desperate energy. "Sterling, stop it," she shrieked. "The board. They've already called for a vote of no confidence. They know about the Cayman transfers. It's over." "It's not over until I have that binder," Sterling roared, turning the gun toward his own sister. The betrayal was complete. The family Eleanor had tried to protect was tearing itself apart on a rain-slicked sidewalk in Seattle. I realized then that I hadn't just built shipyards. I had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies. I had loved children who were genetically programmed to hate me, and I had nearly lost the only true son I had. Suddenly, the blue and red lights flooded the street. 6 patrol cars drifted into a tactical semicircle, their sirens cutting through the Seattle mist. Officers stepped out, crouching behind their doors, weapons drawn. "Drop the weapon. Police, drop the weapon now." Sterling didn't drop it. He looked at the police, then back at me. He saw the end of his life, the end of the jets, the penthouses, the power. He saw the old man he'd tried to bury standing there, broken but unbowed. "You did this," Sterling yelled at me. "You kept us in your shadow for 40 years. You made us wait for a life that was never yours to give." He raised the gun, but he wasn't aiming at me. He was aiming at the binder. He wanted to destroy the truth, even if he had to die to do it. Crack. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the rain. I felt a searing heat bloom in my shoulder, and I stumbled back, hitting the side of my ruined car. The binder fell to the pavement, sliding into a puddle. The police returned fire. A single shot. Sterling's shoulder exploded in a mist of red, and he spun around, collapsing onto the concrete. Victoria screamed, a high, thin sound that reminded me of a wounded bird. The officers swarmed, pinning Sterling down, kicking the gun away. 2 more officers ran to my car, pulling Garrett out, shouting for a medic. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't in the violence. It was in the silence that followed. I sat on the cold, wet ground, clutching my shoulder. The blood was hot and sticky, soaking through my coat. I looked at the binder in the puddle. The water was already blurring the ink on the pages. The Eleanor Protocol, the weapon I had spent weeks refining, was being washed away by the Pacific Northwest rain. I started to laugh. It was a dry, rattling sound that turned into a cough. Beatrice appeared at the edge of the police cordon, Leo clutched in her arms. She saw me and ran past the officers, ignoring their shouts. She knelt beside me, her hands pressing against my wound. "Harrison, stay with me, the ambulance is coming." "The papers, Beatrice," I whispered, nodding toward the puddle. "The truth is dissolving." She looked at the binder, then back at me. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. "Leo didn't just save the silver box, Harrison," she whispered. "He had me copy the SD card the night you reached the estate. The truth is already on a secure server. I sent the link to the federal prosecutor 5 minutes ago." I closed my eyes. A profound sense of peace washed over me. I had been trying to do it all myself, the lone titan, the architect of revenge. But it was the school principal and the 12-year-old boy who had actually won the war. 6 months later, the sun was warm on my face as I sat on the porch of a small, white-shingled house in Key West. It wasn't a mansion, and it didn't have a private dock for a yacht, but it had a clear view of the horizon where the Atlantic met the Gulf. The air smelled of jasmine and sea salt, not grease and exhaust. Garrett was in the yard, teaching Leo how to sand down the hull of an old wooden sailboat we'd bought at an auction. Garrett's hands were steady now. He wasn't trying to build a tech empire, he was building a life. He'd taken over the small remaining Thorne legacy yard in Charleston, the one Sterling had deemed worthless because it was too small to automate. It was profitable, it was honest, and for the first time in his life, my son was happy. Sterling and Victoria were gone. The trial had been the scandal of the decade. The DNA evidence, combined with the embezzlement records and the medical tampering files, had ensured they would spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York. Their true father, Julian Montgomery, had refused to even pay for their legal counsel. He didn't want the taint of their failure near his company. They were truly orphans now, living in the very obsolescence they had planned for me. Beatrice sat in the chair next to me, sipping an iced tea. She'd moved down to the Keys shortly after the trial. "You look like a man who finally found his shore, Harrison," she said. "I think I did," I replied. I looked at my wrist. There was no biometric chip, only a faint scar from the accident in Seattle. I had lost the Thorne maritime empire. The merger had been blocked by the government, and the company had been liquidated to pay back the pension funds. I was no longer a billionaire. I was a man with a comfortable pension, a modest house, and a family that actually loved me. I had learned the hardest lesson of all. A legacy isn't built of steel and stone. It's built of the people who are willing to stand in the rain with you when the ship goes down. I picked up the silver locket Eleanor had left in the vault. I looked at her picture inside. "I was blind, Eleanor," I whispered. but I finally see. I watched Leo and Garrett laugh as the boy accidentally sprayed his father with a hose. The sound carried over the water, sweet and clear. I had been abandoned in a foreign port, erased from my own company, and shot by the man I called my son. But as I sat there, watching the only true Thorne heir learn the craft of our ancestors, I realized that the sea had given me back exactly what I needed. My children thought they had left me with nothing, but in the end, they had stripped away the lies and the greed, leaving me with the only thing that actually mattered, a home. The storm was over. The Thorne had finally taken root in honest soil. This is the story of how my own blood tried to erase me, and how a ghost found his way back to the living. If you ever find yourself in a market in a foreign land, and the person you love tells you to wait by a blue door, take a good look at them. Because sometimes, the people you'd take a bullet for are the ones holding the gun. But remember this, an old shipbuilder knows how to fix a leak. And an old father knows that family isn't about the blood in your veins, it's about who stays on the pier until the very last light fades. In the end, I didn't lose my empire. I finally found my kingdom,